Hello, everyone. Good evening here from Mystery Island in the West Coast or the East Coast of the United States, excuse me. And it's good to have you guys with us. I see there's a number of people already in the chat room, and really excited for tonight's show with Nick Pizza Pickle Spur from Twitter and David Underdown from um, what's that place in Michigan again, David?
Birmingham, Michigan.
Birmingham. I should never forget. There's no ham like Birmingham.
Right.
All right. All right. Well, guys, thanks for coming back. As promised, we had our first little trio together about 3 weeks ago and promised that we would get back together for an update. Meanwhile, I've been trying to do a little bit of studying on our topic tonight, which basically I guess I should introduce to the folks that Nick here was introduced to me by Housatonic by Mark Kulak, and I've really been devouring his material. He's got some terrific material that you can access by just looking at his Twitter, and I also have really benefited by the deep dives of Mark Kulak and David Underdown into the history of the vaccine slash virus slash vaccine uh, scenario that we've been subjected to or facing, or however you want to put it. It's going on a long time, and Nick's been a long time researcher into the AIDS epidemic, and I am a new person to all of it, having knowing nothing about this stuff until the COVID hit us in early 2020. And so now I want to try to put it together. And although I'm not a specialist in this by any means, it is very close to my purpose in trying to expose what happened to my father, because it is the more I study this hepatitis B thing, the more it looks like what he had, and not just a simple case of hepatitis A. Now, we're not here to diagnose my father from 50 years ago, but I'm just letting you know where my thinking is going, because that's why this is so important to me. The idea that he may well have been poisoned, and that ultimately weakened his immune system, and so when he got cancer, he succumbed. Now, in general, been the theory I've been working on for maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 years now. So, that's why it's important to me, but I think it's also important to us because we have to understand what's behind all of this vaccine slash virus back and forth that's going on from COVID to Ebola to MERS and then influenza and all of the coronavirus stuff, RSV. And it appears to me that somehow it all tends to somehow get back into the same small number of people's hands. And maybe that's where we could start tonight, was by identifying a couple of those folks that seem to be almost everywhere when we get into this subject. So with that introduction, who wants to start?
David, would you like the floor?
You can go, Nick.
Okay. Hi, everybody. If we haven't met over the air like this before, I appreciate the introduction. And again, this is a welcome continuation of a discussion that we began a short while back. And tonight we're going to continue going, I think, further and further toward the purposes and potentially the motivations for a lot of these activities. And we're talking about the interaction of public health and biodefense. And then there are clearly some very specific spaces where that intersects, the topic tonight being hepatitis B. So hepatitis B is one of several distinct clades of the hepatitis virum. And hepatitis B really it came into power in, I think we're seeing a little more, as Mark Kulak, you mentioned. Mark has been looking very recently at a yellow fever vaccine campaign that occurred just before the war, and a subsequent wave of hepatitis B in the vaccine recipients. And apparently there's been more of those. Now, in my work as a researcher trying to initially debunk the HIV lab origin crew, I didn't want to believe it. I had quite a strong case of confirmation bias, and as I went painstakingly page by page through their evidence and gathered more and more credible lettered scientists who joined together in that voice, it definitely brought me back to this era. As a kid, I didn't really know or care much about history. I think there's a lot of people who have that sort of luxury. They just don't find a reason to see its importance or how it affects the current day. But why I got into the HIV and the hepatitis work is because of, really wanting to say, I just don't believe that HIV came from a US lab or biodefense work. I just can't accept morally that our institutions would be involved in that. And then came all of the data and all of the evidence. So let's kind of go back to maybe one of the strike points with regard to John's father, the era of concern, which involved intelligence and defense folks being potentially targeted by a weaponized pathogen, a germ that somehow had been attenuated or modified and then made virulent, made more aggressive. There were many, many, many experiments like that, and hepatitis B was certainly on the table as a cancer-causing pathogen. It's communicable, that they were really just getting to understand more. And in the course of this sort of mixture of public health work as well as biodefense work, they introduced the use of the chimpanzee as both a test animal to study live hepatitis infection, and later on, more in the 70s, the efficacy of a hepatitis vaccine with a killed protein vector, and how did that protect these animals from chronic hepatitis infection. But I think you wanted to get to some of the specifics and some of the places that hepatitis research really entered the public domain and knowledge. And one of those places is the Willowbrook State School in New York. And I want to just stop there for comments, questions.
Well, yeah, that's a place that everyone should be investigating. That was famously, I guess, uncovered or revealed by Robert F. Kennedy. And I think Geraldo Rivera, if I recall, was the news person that made this story big. And that was a horrific incident in which we had doctors actually infecting children. And that, when you learn that, then what you said, Nick, about how it just morally is impossible for our government to have done this. And then you have it right in front of your face that look what they did. And not only did they do it, they did it to defenseless children. And, a lot of this resonance with Nazis and eugenics and everything else starts to come back. And you think, wow, maybe we are, the enemy. Maybe it's us. Why are we doing this? And again, that Willowbrook incident, when you first study it, it's got to shock you, and it's just a horrible example of probably hundreds or thousands of similar cases around the country, and not to mention around the world, where children and incapable people, incompetent people are being abused for the sake of experimentation, and that again. Where's the money behind this? Why are they doing this? And I know that part of the story, it certainly has to do with the military and protecting soldiers. I was just reading an article earlier this afternoon in which it said that that they did not know that hepatitis was that was spread by was a virus until 1943. So and this happened during the war because people were getting hepatitis, they were getting sick. But coincidentally, this happened following a lot of inoculations that they were getting because they were going to war and they were soldiers.
Mhm.
And so, what it seems to be, I'm thinking that kind of like global warming in a way. They said to the scientists, okay, here is the narrow field within which you can find the answer, and you can't look outside of these boundaries because we've already decided it's not there. So you have to find it somewhere else. So they started going into the blood and hiding and looking for some little bitty tiny particles in the blood. And that in 1947 they decided or they discovered hepatitis B, and that's the subject of what we're talking about. So I didn't know they had separated hepatitis A and B uh, before 1960, but there they have it in 1947, according to this article. That this whole research stuff seems to be, in a way, a cover up, but you
Well,
know, I don't have the knowledge to show it, but it just seems that way to me.
let's ground that. It's quite a rational observation, John. And for those that aren't familiar with the relationships between some of these large entities, I think everyone understands what a pharmacology company is, right? Our whole lives, we've all seen advertisements from Bayer and Pfizer and Merck. So we understand what those things are to a certain extent as a profit driven private enterprise, a corporation. We also understand to a degree what our regulatory agencies are: the Food and Drug Administration, the CDC, the NIH, and some of its subsidiaries like Tony Fauci's NIAID. And then what most folks are unaware of, that's where the curtain is usually drawn. And we're going to pull that back and say connected deeply. I mean, I'm not talking about, light peripheral associations, but a deep intrinsic infrastructure exists between those first two entities and our defense and intelligence communities. And that's where it gets weird because we now have a bifurcation of activities that should, and by the letter, are being launched in the defense of public health to try to help eliminate and reduce the spread of disease and human suffering. And at the same time, there are forces inside of those institutions. There are guest stars, and there are offsite labs, and there are related programs to what we all see as the public face of national health agencies. But there's a defense, and what they call it biodefense, others call it biowarfare segment. And that's where this gets very difficult. We don't get to see all of the papers and all of the activities. But unfortunately, as we're discussing in some of the work tonight, we see it in the aftermath of public health. And my main thrust of work about HIV is that it was a quite deliberate, clearly intentioned and sanctioned and organized activity to create that kind of a bioweapon. It was spoken about years before it hit the scene of public health. We can trace precisely incremental steps in how they brought it from the chimpanzee into human beings and studied and understood precisely what it was as a pathogen, what it would do to the health of the people who received it. And therein lies part of our moral conundrum of, how is this stuff morally acceptable? How are we doing this with public money? Aren't there international laws against this? And it does get more and more complex from there. David, I want to pull you in here.
Yeah.
anything in the mid 50s space that's, particularly interesting or stands out to you about Hep B?
Well, not specifically Hep B. I'm definitely not an expert in Hep B, but I'm more interested in kind of the overall programs that you talked about, and I do agree that inoculation for soldiers is a very old part of the program, and even with the character like a Walter Reed, who is our military hospital is named after. His original work was malaria and yellow fever, and that was for the Spanish American War and going into more tropical areas. So these concepts have been around for a long time, as far as and I think for the population, the idea of protecting our soldiers against diseases and familiar areas that may have disease that our soldiers aren't used to is very acceptable. But of course, the components that are not discussed is the biological warfare departments and the chemical warfare departments. And I think that it's a dark part of the history of warfare that's gone on for a very long time. And the United States has definitely been a participant in that, going back to even the revolution and clearing out Indians from territory that we wanted to develop as new frontiers for the United States. So that's a part of history that we don't want to talk about. But another program that I think is related was the syphilis testing that was done, because again, like when we talk about these super projects during World War II, which in this this 40s era, I mean, we had the atomic bomb, radar, and the proximity fuse were the two or the three big military weapons. But the big medical desire was to have a penicillin, and that was another big program that I feel like was really rolled in with a lot of this National Defense Research Committee, which spurs the Manhattan Project. And even looking at things like at Oak Ridge National Lab, where they were doing what was called nuclear medicine and sort of experimenting with radium and radiation and seeing how that could affect could either prevent cancers or cause cancers. All that stuff is stuff that I look at and try to kind of track the players involved with things like that. But what I'd found was that NYU seemed to have and had an old history with this hepatitis specifically, and that was something that it was interesting to me that Walter Reed had studied there. And then of course with more contemporary names that people think of, like the who is it, the Carl Icahn. He has a big medical center there. The Tisches, who are another one of these families that seem to be involved with the opium, with the propaganda due in the Vatican Bank and that whole Franklin Bank scandal. That seems like a lot of these. And again, like with the opium, it's a double-sided thing. It can be pain relief, or it can be used as for an opium war. So those are the things that I think about. I mean, I don't have I haven't deeply studied hepatitis to the level that you certainly have, but I'm very interested to hear what your studies and analysis on hepatitis and its role into more contemporary issues we face.
Yeah, these are all names that are very, very important to the era, and what most people I find again and again. And friends, I wasn't, like I said, I wasn't a historian in my younger years. I was too busy in the moment and chasing after, what am I doing? What am I going to do tonight? Really had a goldfish attention span in a lot of ways. And at some point, this all just clicked. It changed. And I started reading and seeing the importance of this history and seeing how it persists to this day, how decisions and policies and things that were set into motion decades ago are still quite germane and quite alive in science and in health policy and certainly in defense. So one of the things that I want to kind of do is step back from Hep B and talk about what you just brought up, and that's the nuclear component in any kind of federally funded NIH research. So we're talking about a particular three-letter agency that was generally branded or stamped on any of these projects that had to do with any sort of radiation at all, anything to do with radiation, and they could be under the cover of the Department of Energy. So the DOE really has a variety of functions. I'm hard on them because they aren't transparent as I would like them to be. As a citizen, I think we should be able to know, and I understand the boundaries of civil defense and national defense, and that we can't all know everything that's happening. But I think that sort of national defense exemption has been a point of abuse in this entire track of covering up semi and fully illegal gain of function activities in our national laboratories and certainly in the major universities that took part in all of these projects. We're not talking about some bad folks at Fort Detrick. We're talking about biologists at MIT and Purdue and Tulane and USC and University of Washington and University of Michigan, you name it. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So that's where I think this is a fascinating side effect. And that's being allowed to essentially exempt yourself from disclosure, from public transparency, by simply saying this is a national defense issue. And furthermore, it's involved with the Department of Energy, who owns all things nuclear. I know that Mark Kulak is, probably just a memorized expert on this, but he and I both feel a point of contention about this. John, have you seen anything in that space? I think we touched on the nuclear topic prior, but what have you seen with DOE?
Well, I'm not up to speed on that myself.
Okay.
As far as I share your suspicions. I share your oogies when I see it's a DOE project and they can hide anything there. And so generally I would just say it's a great place to hide secret projects.
To give people a sense of what is a DOE microbiology project. I mean, how do you cross atomic science with something in a test tube? Well, they would use a particle accelerator. Just think of a particle gun to fire ionizing radiation or non-ionizing radiation at a target pathogen, a sample. And the point of it was basically twofold. One, they had learned very early on that by exposing people and animals to brief radiation bursts, particularly things like gamma, that they could trigger the expression of your latent infectious burden. That's a mouthful. That means the germs and the pathogens that you have picked up that to date your body deals with. It keeps them kind of in a trunk. It keeps them quiet. But sometimes we get triggered, literally. And they found that ionizing radiation was one of those triggers that could make a silent or latent disease manifest. The other major, I think, driver of using atomic technology in the microbiology space was to trigger mutagenesis, to take a pathogen and literally try to mutate it, try to damage it. And that's one of the techniques that we call attenuation. You can attenuate biologically, chemically, and with radiation. So imagine that we take hepatitis B and we fire a particle gun at the virus sample, and it damages the viruses, but they're not quite dead. Then you move hepatitis B into a new cell culture or a different animal. And in its attempt to survive and struggle. Life finds a way, like they said in Jurassic Park. The virus will acclimatize. It will adjust to the new available food sources and DNA sources. Not every time, not immediately, not on the first attempt, but this was one of those techniques.
Just
That sounds an awful lot like something we've been hearing about recently in a more recent pandemic situation in which it's been suggested that certain injections might be have a similar effect of reawakening a sleeping germ or two. I don't know if
Yeah.
you've heard that, but I have.
I have. And I'll tell you, I went back, as I said, I really kind of started my experience as a serious investigator, as a debunker. I wasn't out on coast to coast. I wasn't attacking anybody, but just personally, I went at a lot of these very difficult theories with a high degree of incredulity, and I scrutinized everything. And one of the things that I heard early on that I thought that can't be right was the accusation that cell phone radiation was a potential influence on human health. And I quite frankly saw the number of not just minutes, but hours and hours of time that people were spending using different devices. People just glued to their phones nowadays, particularly the kids. And I at first thought, well, anecdotally, this doesn't really seem to hold water for me. Then I went and looked up the material from the United States Department of Defense from the 1950s and 60s, where they were quite specifically looking for exactly the effects that we were just talking about. So I have remain open to the potential and the possible risk of something like 5G in relation to activating endogenous genes, or they're called oncogenes, or they're called latent infections. There's different names for them. So certainly, I think that's a serious space. And I'm of the opinion, just with what I've learned about cumulative electromagnetic radiation exposure, that lowering, just trimming the amount of exposure you get, turning off your Wi-Fi, not having your phone next to you in the bed, all of those good habits are things that are worth examining.
I was just recalling that we before the show, I guess it was a few days ago, we were talking about a couple of individuals that we wanted to cover tonight, and let me just bring up their names. So one of them is Saul Krugman, and the other one is Morris Hilleman. I know Mark has talked a lot about Hilleman. I imagine he's quite familiar with both of these, but I'm not. So let's ask David to introduce us to these two guys.
well, the Maurice Hilleman was, I think, as Mark said, was the man that created the most vaccines of any vaccinologist of the 20th century. I believe he was at Merck. I think he was the head of their vaccine department, and um, he I one of the things I wanted to say before too with Department of Energy for people to remember was that was the rebranding of the Atomic Energy Commission. So that was something that was originally the AOC, and then they changed. Then Carter rebranded it as the Department of Energy. So the Department of Energy's roots are deeply connected to the Manhattan Project and the Atomic Energy Commission. But as far as Hilleman, he was a Merck scientist. We talked on the first show that we did, the first trio. We talked about the history of Merck with George Merck and with Vannevar Bush's taking over as the chairman of Merck after George Merck dies. George Merck was also the person that was the head of the biological warfare department during World War II that worked with a man named Ira Baldwin, who was somebody that I always like to bring up because he was the head of the biology department at the University of Wisconsin, which he trained Sidney Gottlieb, and Joshua Lederberg was somebody that also went through Wisconsin. But Merck, as Nick said, was one of the major cells that was used to bring in, people from Germany post World War II. That the continuation of these programs, which makes sense if you think about it, with Merck being originally being a German pharmaceutical company, a very, very old, very, very old corporation. I think over 300 years. And, so, Hillman, I honestly, I'm not like, I really offered that more for Nick to talk about, because I knew he would know a lot about them. I thought I was more interested because I was looking at NYU, and it just sort of stood out with their history with the American Chemical Society as well, which goes back to the 19th century, and that again is an awful fishy organization that seems a lot like the American version of IG Farben, where they're coming up with sort of a cartel where they're talking about patents. And the first president of this American Chemical Society becomes the expert for the Rockefellers, and when they were doing patent law with petroleum, cracking techniques and all these things, they used this expert from the American Chemical Society, which was deeply connected with NYU and with Columbia University, which again are both schools that have ties to the same Manhattan Project. So that was more of what I wanted to bring to to why I brought up those characters. I knew Nick would know much more about their specific role in which vaccines and medical products that they had specifically worked on.
Let me just jump in. If I recall, New York University was the one started by Aaron Burr, and
No, it was Gallatin.
oh, okay, Gallatin. But okay, what is Gallatin but a Swiss,
Exactly.
agent that might vary, from Geneva,
and also set up in Pittsburgh, where the supposedly the Henry Bouquet and Amherst do the first biological attack at Fort Pitt. So that was where Gallatin was also out in that area. So again, that's going way back to the Revolutionary War. But it's just interesting that was the person that financed NYU.
Well, on top of what you guys have already said, I think it's important to remind everyone of our work on the Health Alteration Committee, which was active in the 50s. It was created by Alan Dulles and included Boris Posh and Richard Bissell and a couple of other, I think Wisner maybe, but the usual suspects, the old OSS guys that did the really dirty stuff. And they had memos, and they what they were trying to do was to debilitate people from being effective at their jobs without necessarily killing them, and also finding ways to kill people over time, such as with cancer or heart attacks or cardiac, cardiovascular disease, so that it doesn't look like they did it. And so, if I'm right about my theory, then I not only have got to prove that it was possible, but to dig through the layers of deception that they will be hiding behind. Nevertheless, I think I'm going to keep going on this. Um, we It was interesting to get into the early history of uh, the separation. It says here in this article I was reading earlier that this guy named F.O. McCallum in 1947, using human volunteers, differentiates hepatitis A, which is spread by contaminated food and water, from hepatitis B, which is spread by blood. Human volunteers have been very, very important in all of these testing procedures, and that gets back to syphilis and Tuskegee and the other horrific experiments on prisoners and mentally ill people. But again, to push this so hard to try, that you're going to uh, use prisoners, that you're going to cross that moral boundary, that you're going to use children, that you're going to do these things to old people. That's Nazi. That is Nazi mentality. And so these people that are doing these things are tainted in their moral judgments of against humanity and in favor of this horrific thing, whatever we're calling it, the deep state, the empire, the blob, the whatever it is, that the hidden hand. Um, they are um, connected in the same way that Hitler was to this dark power that doesn't care about human life. It just wants more and more power, and to, as Mark has been discovering, and other people, that they really are right at this point just trying to poke us with things to see how we react, so that they can learn more and more and more about the chemistry and the biology of the human. I don't know if they're going to start building orcs in some mountain hideaway that they're going to take over the world with, or they're just going to make use incubators to make babies to suit themselves, designer babies. But all of this is so horrific. It's science fiction coming to life right in our very, very right in front of us. And I I don't know what else to say except for this is not America. This is not the country that we're supposed to be living in. Something's going really, really wrong, and part of it is the willingness to use human guinea pigs to find out. Can we give that team cancer, so that while our team has a vaccine for cancer? Can we do that sword and shield thing to win a war? Or can we find that secret little tweak that will cause somebody to die in 5 years that they'll never know we did it? Um, all of that stuff has been going on since World War II. And yeah, Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, all of the secret spy agencies. Um, I guess it's got to stop. We got to stop doing this. I don't know if it's lab leaks or intentional, but it's getting out into the human population in a big way. And I, don't- I don't. It's just such a huge problem that we can't explain it to people. So that's what we're trying to do here. So let me shut up and let you guys take over. We were going to talk about the other gentleman, Saul Krugman, too.
Yeah.
And let's turn it over to Nick.
Sure, sure. So before we get into Saul Krugman, who is one of many people in this enterprise that's of concern, I want to speak to what you just shared. Um, a lot of us of a certain age range tend to anchor our sense of all evil in the world ties back to World War II, and it's all the Nazis. It was very, very difficult to get that out of your mind if you or your parents lived through that experience. Um, I would posit firmly that we need to continue to look at the principles of what the Nazis did. And certainly they were scientifically masterful in ways that we coveted, in ways that were superior to the United States and its allies in certain aspects. They were ambitious in a way that was a monstrous hubris. You can't become a cancer and just consume the rest of the planet and remake it in your own image. So it taught us something very, very important about limits. But they used principles from us. They praised the American Eugenics Society. So this concept of what I'm trying to do is to dispel the idea that there's these ancient Nazi relics somewhere, hidden away in an upstairs attic, and they're on an IV drip, and they are the pinnacle of all of this evil. America had all kinds of dehumanizing practices and policies. At the time that World War II broke out, we had over 30 states with eugenics laws on the books. You think a compulsory vaccination feels like a loss of medical freedom? Try society has judged that you shouldn't breed, and you are therefore going to be forcibly sterilized in a procedure. Imagine that. So we have this weird back and forth in our history that we want to, we don't want to integrate it into our thinking, but we need to understand it. But coming back to the Nazis, yes, we drank the poison. We talked about the paper clips before. We talked specifically tonight about the biological paper clips that gathered at the Merck Corporation. I did not know, David, how old that company was. That's fascinating. And yes, they were right there at the table as one of the primary contracting firms that provided corporate cover, the private public partnership. That you've heard that phrase over and over, and you just think of, you think of the opening credits on your favorite PBS show. Public-private partnerships can be horrible when they allow an out-of-control entity like defense or intelligence to offshore or near shore illegal biodefense activities and hide it behind a corporate proprietary shroud. That is an abuse. And I don't think that talking about this means that I'm trying to undermine confidence in our national agencies. I don't think the Department of Homeland DHS should be able to put out definitions that people who have these kinds of conversations are somehow terrorists to the United States. That's absurd. And those people need to be, they need to be replaced immediately. But we have this big piece in our national heart and consciousness about Nazi evil and have to root it out. And how do we get rid of it? And it's part of us. We have to be able to speak to it. We have to speak to hatred. We have to speak to bigotry. We have to speak to dehumanization in our own spaces and in our own ways. But it's been a part of us all along. So I think that we don't burn down the house and build anew. I think we clean house is my personal approach. Now, coming back to Saul Krugman was, at the time that we sort of bring several of these characters together and the topic of hepatitis B in public health, finds himself working at, I believe, the nation's largest public health facility called Willowbrook State School in New York. And this turned into over a decade long, we'll say, series of experiments and projects. Some people call it a catastrophe, an atrocity. Other people make justifications about what occurred, but it boils down to children that were used over a long period of time as wards of the state for hepatitis B, specifically, Hep B experiments, and some quite questionably ethical or unethical practices in the course of that work. Saul found himself, once the news broke, because you said at the beginning, you gave the tip that a very, very young Geraldo Rivera, I'm still fascinated by this, found in his possession a key to the side door and brought a film crew in and broke the story. I think it was 1972. At that point, the lead scientists came under great scrutiny. And within a couple of years, both of them had pivoted and moved on to new things. Saul Krugman, I am just watching today for the first time a 1975 presentation that he makes. And he's talking and he's opining about the hepatitis B era, about the certain different milestones that he acknowledges or questions, and in his own way seems to be kind of rewriting the story of hepatitis. It would be interesting, now that you shared that article, John, to take some of the milestones that are, I guess, externally verifiable and compare them to Saul's interpretation. But how this dovetails into the HIV story is Saul ends up being appointed the safety officer because he was at the New York University. I believe he's part of the Hep B division or department. So he was part of the safety officer for the men's hepatitis B trials in New York, which appeared to be where HIV was introduced into the U.S. population.
I'm going to read just a paragraph here from this article. It's called NAS Online, nasonline.org publication, and it's called Hepatitis B Story.pdf. Several experiments showed that the particles. He's saying they found some particles of that they're saying is particles of Hep B. Several experiments showed that the particles could induce protective immunity. In 1971, infectious disease expert Saul Krugman of New York University published a paper on the accidental discovery that injections of hepatitis B contaminated blood that had been heated to kill viruses gave some protection against Hep B. Although the nucleic acid-free particles Bloomberg isolated could not cause disease, several findings suggested they could be used to stimulate immunity against the infectious virus. Intrigued by the notion that HBsAg, that's I guess the old name for Hep B, provokes an immune response that protects people from hepatitis B, Bloomberg and Irving Millman, working at FCCC, proposed a vaccine that could be made from HBsAg particles obtained from the blood of Hep B carriers. And then they go into how they made it, and it gets into exactly what you're saying. So, I mean, this idea of human guinea pigs being used is exactly where you pick up with your research, right?
Well, there's so many. I mean, in the backdrop, as you mentioned, of all of this for 40 years, from 1932 until 1972, the NIH directly managed and monitored the village, the town of Tuskegee, Alabama, and allowed syphilis to spread and proliferate and kill. And their main repeated justification for not stopping the human suffering and the dying was, quote, "We don't want to disturb the data," end quote. If that isn't cold, if that isn't dehumanizing, you tell me. But that's happening in parallel, along with the Guatemala syphilis study that Hillary Clinton had to apologize for. They made her stand up and take the hit for it and say, "We're sorry for letting you suffer with the disease." How many other sites? The NIH only concedes of these horrible behaviors and illegal activities when they're forced to. That tells me we need to clean house. So it helps to shine a bright spotlight on the problem. And one of the other things that I think is part of that cure, if we're talking about, shock to their system, is to cleave out the Defense Department positions in the board. For those of you that don't know, about 50% of the people that lead our national health apparatus are in the Defense Department. And I'm sorry, but if you don't know what happens to folks that are career defense, whose minds are focused for decades and decades on killing and defense and weaponry, they don't all go to the loony bin, but some of them certainly need to be shown out to pasture. And they shouldn't be forming and influencing federal or international policy with these types of values. They have this foregone conclusion towards destruction and acquisition and conflict, and it's quite two-dimensional. They're talking monkeys, in my opinion. So I've said quite enough. David, what say you?
Well, it's sad for me because I feel like the when you talk about this obsession with this people with the Nazi relics and having that come out, that immediately what I think with that is I do think of Ewan Cameron at McGill. He was the kind of the leader of the idea that Germans are genetically predisposed to these tendencies, and that the idea that there, could be reemerge was a big part of his psychology. And he of course was involved, much like Sidney Gottlieb. He was very involved in the using LSD and using shock treatment and all these different aggressive what were denazification techniques. I mean, that was a term that was used post World War II. It was interesting that language was used during the Ukrainian conflict as well when it first broke out. But where I think of that really coming about was Camp King in Germany, where a lot of these characters started. And of course, as we've sort of, I feel like, said ad nauseum, a lot of these characters were people that had trained in American universities, and the people leading the American universities had gone to Germany and trained, because as you'd alluded to, the Germans, they were known for being very advanced in a lot of medical pharmaceuticals and medical treatment, but also in engineering, aviation, things like that. They really were world leaders in that stuff. And so, being from Detroit, you can really trace that. And one of the sad characters for me was Charles Wilson, who was the chairman of General Motors, that became the Secretary of Defense with right when Allen Dulles goes in. Dulles and Wilson created what was called the New Look for the Department of Defense and for the CIA, and that involved using some of these techniques that John had talked about, as far as using covert activity. And that was sort of always the what we'd been told was the FBI deals with domestic events and the CIA is overseas, and that there's a separation between those things. And just it's hard, because as we've uncovered, the system has been designed to provide clearances and plausible deniability for characters that are involved in this stuff. It's just really, you don't want to believe is possible, but it's that's the reality of it, is that we do need to expose it, and hope that these kind of talks can get traction for where people will look into it, or because it's I don't know what to say. It's just it's hard, because I just feel like within my own family, it's hard, because I just everybody wants to give good advice, or try to help everybody to be healthy. And we're just dealing, it just seems like we're in a phase now where we're just going to be pummeled with all these new outbreaks, and the response to it. And it just seems like we're getting set for another round of this stuff, with all the talk of the a new round of virus coming from China, and people, all that. I mean, it just feels like we're heading into the same situation we've been in for the last couple of years. And I don't know how to to handle it, because, like, as you said, I mean, the organizations that are involved in it are DTRA and DARPA, and these private public partnerships with there's a lot of, it's a big obstacle.
It is.
Well, I guess we all agree on that. And just one little other thing, just a little nugget from this article. I'm going to put the link to this article in the show notes, but it's published in 2000. So on the one hand, this information was still a little bit fresh to the writers. On the other hand, the past 20 some years of additional knowledge, but also additional maybe cover up was not present. So there's some things in here that may be of great help to us as we do more research. He says in 1973, Stephen Feinstone and colleagues at NIH used an electron microscope to visualize viral particles in the stools of infected individuals. At about the same time, Hilleman, that's Maurice Hilleman we were speaking of, and colleagues at Merck defined and characterized the human hepatitis A virus that Feinstein had purified from the infected livers of marmosets, a type of monkey. So wait a minute. So hepatitis A comes from the monkeys too? Um, how much of this is Merck doing bioweapons and on that idea that we've got to win the war, crossing that ethical boundary and taking monkey stuff and putting it into human veins?
You tell me about the
Wow.
nature. You tell me about the nature of men's character, and when they are enacted to be in ultimate control and command,
Yeah.
and then asked to relinquish that. You tell me how many men would relinquish it. It comes back to Lord of the Rings. It's the risk of having the ring of power, that it will corrupt and destroy anyone who comes at it with a sense of, well, I'll use it for good. Sure. But these companies and this mentality that fired up in the war never went back in. They went out for recess, John, and they never came back. Right? They went out into the wilderness of their own new world definition. And there were circumstances, and it was dire, and it was beyond life and death. It was existential, it seemed. So we can make all kinds of concessions about how they arrived at this place, but we never reined them back in. And all of the most grave cautions that we were given by Eisenhower and Kennedy and others continue to resonate. And so we take it, David, to come back to your point about how monumental it is. We take it a piece at a time. We think quite strategically. We try to maintain a civil and organized and humane practice about all of it. We might find some things that the public wants to light torches and get their pitchforks sharpened for. And we try to help whatever apparatus is going to do this change management to maintain that civility, because the idea isn't to burn down the field. It's to excise the problems and to separate defense from public health, in my opinion.
Well said. Well said. And yeah, it's a great summation of our work and a great way to look towards 2023 as uh, a program of continuing to study and expose and do deep research and deep dives so that the public somehow, some way, will be energized to make it stop. This is still, as far as I'm concerned, the last best hope of humanity on Earth. And like Nick just said, we don't want to burn it down. We just want to throw out the bad stuff and get back to being the best country on Earth. And David, thank you very much for being with us tonight and for contributing a lot of interesting background. And Nick, thank you so much. I feel like we're on we're marching along a very, very broad front, advancing slowly, but inevitably, we're going to win this.
Indeed.
All right, everybody. Thank you again, and have a very, very good New Year. Don't forget, tomorrow night, Professor Hamamoto will be with me to wrap up his thoughts for 2022, and I always really enjoy those conversations. So join us tomorrow night right here on McDuff Lives 1 and McDuff Lives on Facebook and Twitter. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.